We're going to continue our web development journey and explore CSS in more detail. So in this section, we're going to cover the essential CSS concepts you need to understand to build beautiful web pages. We'll talk about various ways to provide CSS. Then we'll talk about normalizing CSS so we get consistent result across different browsers. Then we're going to talk about selectors in detail. With these selectors, we can target various elements for styling. Once you understand these selectors and how they work, then we'll talk about some cool things you can do with CSS. We'll talk about colors, gradients, borders, and shadows. If you want to learn CSS well and become a ninja web developer, don't miss any lessons in this section. So let's jump in and get started. Let's talk about 3 different ways to provide styles. We can use embedded style sheets, which is what we have been doing so far. So we embed or include our styles in our HTML documents. We can also use external style sheets, which means we can write our styles in separate files. This has a couple of benefits, which we're going to talk about in a second. And we can also use inline styles, and with this, we can apply a style directly to a particular HTML element. So in this lesson, I'm going to start by creating a paragraph with 5 words. Now let's duplicate it so we have a couple of elements to work with. Next, we go to the style element and define a rule for our paragraphs. I'm going to set the color to orange, and with this, we get 2 orange paragraphs. Now, what we have here is an embedded style sheet. There are 2 problems with these style sheets. The first problem is that they're not scalable. So if we have multiple pages, it is likely that on other pages, we want our paragraphs to be orange. With this approach, we have to copy all the styles that we have here and put them on every single web page. And that means if tomorrow we decide to change the color of our paragraphs, we have to go to every single web page and make modifications. So this approach is not scalable. The second problem with this approach is that it violates a very important principle in computer science called separation of concerns. So we want to have different modules for different concerns. As we have learned so far, we use HTML to structure our web pages, and we use CSS to style them. These are 2 different concerns, so we should separate them. Let me give you a metaphor. Think of a supermarket. In a supermarket, we have different sections for different types of products. We have a section for fruits and vegetables and another section for cleaning products. Now imagine if you had a supermarket with only a single section. All the products were in a single section. We could never find anything in that supermarket, right? So we want to organize our code like a well-organized supermarket. This is where we use external style sheets. So we can take all these styles and put them in a separate file. So in this project, I'm going to create a new file called styles.css. We could call it anything. The name doesn't matter. But styles is a pretty common name. What matters is that the extension should be CSS. Okay? Now, let's go to index.html and copy our CSS rule. Well, I'm going to cut it and then paste it over here. So I only moved the CSS rule, not the style element, okay? Now, let's save the changes. Back in index.html, we can get rid of the style element and instead link this HTML document to our external style sheet. To do that, we use the link element. So link tab. This element has 2 attributes, rel or relationship, which determines the type of resource we're linking this document to. In this case, a style sheet. The second attribute is href, which you already know about, right? So here we can type a relative or an absolute URL. In this case, I'm going to go with the relative URL. So we're currently on index.html, and our external style sheet is in the same folder. So here we can type styles.css. Now save the changes. We get the same result as before. Now one thing I want to clarify here. This link element is what we call a self-closing element. So as you can see, here we don't have opening and closing tags. We have a single tag, which is self-closed over here. The alternative way to write this is to open it first and then close it manually. But this makes our code a little bit longer. So by default, VS Code generates a self-closing tag like this. That is better. So does it mean we should never use embedded styles? No. Sometimes we want to overwrite the styles that are defined in an external style sheet. For example, let's say on this web page only, we want to change the color of our paragraphs. So we add a style element and define a new rule for our paragraph elements. Here we can set the color to black And now, look, our paragraphs are black. So the rules that we define here override the rules defined in an external style sheet, okay? So these are two different ways to provide styles, but there's a third way. We can use inline styles to apply styles to a particular HTML element. So let's say out of these two paragraphs, I want to make the first paragraph blue, but only the first paragraph. Every HTML element has a style attribute, and this is where we can write one or more styles. So we can set the color to blue, add a semicolon, so we can type a second CSS declaration. So we can set font weight to bold. Now don't worry about these styles, we'll talk about them later. Now, let's look at the result. So the first paragraph is blue and bold. What we have here is an example of an inline style. Now, inline styles are pretty ugly. You should avoid them as much as possible because they violate the separation of concern principle. We're defining some styles in the middle of our markup. But what if we really want to make the first paragraph bold and blue? Well, there are better ways. For example, we can give this paragraph a unique identifier. So we set the ID to first, and then over here, we define a rule for our first paragraph. So we start our rule with a pound sign, and then we type the ID of our element. Now, the styles that we define here will only be applied to an element with this identifier. So now we can take these two styles and move them over here. Okay, and then we can get rid of the inline style. Now we have better separation of concerns. So as you probably know, we have quite a few different browsers out there, and unfortunately, different browsers render some HTML elements differently. Now, to address this issue, we use a very popular style sheet called Normalized CSS. What this style sheet does is that it provides basic default styles for some HTML elements so they look exactly the same way across different browsers. And with this, we don't have to waste a lot of time dealing with these rendering issues across different browsers, okay? So just go to google.com and search for normalized.css. Now look at the first link, nicholas.github.io. On this page, you can download the latest version. You can also install this using npm, but this is for advanced users, so I'm not going to cover it at this point. So right-click on this button and save the file somewhere on your desk. Now back to our project, we currently have a style sheet over here, and we're going to add another style sheet. So now it's time to organize these style sheets inside a new folder called CSS. So I'm going to add a new folder here, CSS, in the root of our website. Now I'm going to move styles.css over here. Let's go to index.html and update the URL as well. So it should be css/styles.css. Next, we're going to drag and drop normalized.css into the CSS folder. Good. Now let me give you an example of what is happening here so it's no longer magic to you. For example, normalized.css sets the line height property of the HTML element to 1.15 because different browsers have different values for this property. Here's another example. Normalized.css sets the margin of the body element to 0. And with this rule, you're no longer going to have some space around the content of our body element. So the moment we link to normalized.css, you will see that this space will be gone. But don't worry, we'll come back and fix it in a second. So back to index.html. Before linking to styles.css, first we should link to normalized.css. So link, here we type css/normalized.css. Now save the changes. Look, the space that I was talking to you about is gone. So to solve this problem, we have to go to styles.css, and on the top, we're going to define a rule for the body element. Here we're going to set the margin to 10 pixels, and this will bring back the space that we had earlier. Now don't worry about the margin property at this stage. We're going to talk about it in more detail later in the course. So normalizing our CSS styles is a very important step in front-end development, and going forward, we're going to use normalized.css in all the future lessons. In CSS, we have a few different ways to select elements for styling purposes. We can select them by their type, by their ID, by their class, and their attributes. We have seen a few examples early in the course, but let's go through it one more time with more detail. First, let's get the terminology right. What we have over here is called a selector, because this is how we can select an element. Now, in this example, we're selecting an element by its type, which is the body element, but we can also select an element by its ID. So in index.html, let's create a section with the ID of products. So using Zen coding, we can type section pound products and then press tab. So this generates the section element and give it the ID of products. Now to style this element, we can go to our style sheet and type pound products. So whenever we start with a pound, that means we're selecting with an ID. Now we can also select elements by their class. For example, here we can add 3 articles with the class of product. So we can type article, period, product times 3. This generates 3 article elements with the class of product, okay? Now, to style each article element, we can go to our style sheet and type period, product. Now here's a question for you. What is the difference between the ID and class attributes? We talked about this earlier in the course, so you should know the answer. Pause the video and think about it for a second. Here's the answer. We cannot have multiple elements with the same ID, but we can have multiple elements with the same class. Here's a metaphor. In the real world, we cannot have 2 people with the same passport number, right? By the same token, we cannot have 2 elements with the same identifier. So IDs must be unique, but we can have multiple elements with the same class, okay? So these are the most common way to select elements, by their type, by their ID, and their class. But we can also select elements by their attribute, which is not really that common, but I want to cover it here because you might see it in other people's code. So over here, let's add an anchor and link to google.com. And here we can say Google. Now, let's give this anchor the target element and set it to blank. Do you remember what this does? When we apply this attribute and click on this link will open in a new tab, okay? Now, let's say we want to select all anchor elements that have a target attribute. To do that, we can type a square brackets target. So we're checking for the existence of the target attribute, but the value doesn't matter. Now, if you want to be more explicit about the value, we can use an equal sign and type the value here, underline blank. As another example, let's select by the href attribute. So we can select anchor elements that point to Google, https google.com. Now there's a problem with this code. Code like this is often fragile. A simple change in this link will break our style. Let me show you what I mean. So here I'm going to set the color to orange. Now let's verify that our rule is working. So we get an orange link. Now, if I go back to index.html and add a / here, our rule breaks. The reason this is happening is because we're checking for the exact match. So that's why I said code like this is often fragile. To make our code more flexible, we can check for the existence of the word Google. So here we type Google, and then we prefix the equal sign with an asterisk. Now our rule is working, beautiful. If we make any changes to this link, for example, if we type a few more characters, our rule is still working. Now we can also check to see if the attribute starts with a given value. So here we type a caret and then replace Google with HTTPS. This will select all anchor elements whose href attribute starts with HTTPS. We can also check to see if the attribute ends with a given value. To do that, use a $sign. But we can also combine multiple conditions. For example, here I can type another square brackets and say the href attribute should start with HTTPS and end with .com. That's another way. But again, selecting by attributes is not really that common. Most of the time, we select elements by their type, ID, and class. So this is all about the basic selectors. Next, we're going to talk about relational selectors. So you have learned how to select elements using the basic selectors. But we can also select elements based on their relationship with other elements. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to generate a section with the ID of products. And in this section, I'm going to add a paragraph with 5 words. The content doesn't matter. Now let's say we want to style this paragraph element. One way to do this is by giving this element an ID or a class. But there's another way. We can start from this section. Because this section already has an ID, we can start here and then select the paragraph element inside this section. With this approach, we don't have to define an ID or a class on this attribute. So our markup will end up being cleaner. Let me show you how this works. So we go to our style sheet and start with the product section. Then we select the paragraph element. So we're combining 2 different selectors, right? So here I'm going to set the color to orange. Let's make sure it's working. Good. So this is an example of a relational selector. What we have here is called a descendant selector. But don't worry about the terminology too much. Just understand how this works. Now, this rule will apply to any paragraph elements inside the product section. For example, if you go over here and after this paragraph, we add an article with a paragraph and type something else here, this second paragraph will also be orange. Let me show you. So save the changes, take a look. Both paragraphs are orange. But what if you wanted to style only the first paragraph? That is this paragraph element that is a direct child of the product section. To do that, we have to type a greater than sign in between these 2 selectors. Now, only the first paragraph is orange. We have another relational selector for selecting siblings. So back to index.html, after this section, I'm going to add another paragraph. Now, let's say we want to style this paragraph element that is a direct sibling of the section element. So it comes right after the section. To do that, we type a plus in between these 2 selectors. Now, the third paragraph is orange. So this will select the paragraph element that comes immediately after the product section. So if you go to our markup and add another paragraph element, this second paragraph is not going to be orange. Take a look. See? Only the third paragraph is orange. But what if you want to style all paragraph elements that come after the product section? Well, we can replace the plus sign with a tilde. Now, this will select all paragraph elements that are general siblings of the product section. So both these 2 paragraphs are orange. So relational selectors help us write cleaner markup because we don't have to assign IDs and classes to various HTML elements. But there are 2 problems with relational selectors that you need to be aware of. The first problem is that they can be fragile because they're dependent on the location of these elements in the DOM. So if you move elements around, our styles will break. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have a rule for selecting all paragraph elements that come after the product section. Now let's say tomorrow, we decide to move this paragraph and put it before the product section. So I'm going to cut this line and then paste it over here. Now, this line is not going to be orange. Here you go. So if we move elements around, our styles will break. The second problem with these selectors is that they are not as performant as basic selectors. Now, don't think too much about this because most of the time, the difference is negligible. You cannot even tell the difference. But let me explain why these selectors are not as fast as basic selectors. The reason goes back to how browsers read and execute these selectors. We humans start from the left side and go to the right side. So we go to the product section and then select all paragraphs that come after, right? This algorithm is not efficient for browsers. They start from the right side. So when a browser sees this selector, it selects all paragraph elements in the DOM, and then for each paragraph element, it checks to see if that element comes after the product section. Now, imagine on this page we have 100 paragraph elements. So the browser will select all these 100 paragraph elements just to find out that there is only one paragraph element that comes after the product section. So all that time to query those 99 paragraph elements will be wasted. Now, once again, most of the time, the difference is negligible. So don't optimize ahead of time. Remember the old saying in computer science, premature optimization is the root of all evils. So to recap, relational selectors help us write cleaner markup, but sometimes they can be fragile. if you're very confident that the location of these elements you're targeting is not going to change in the future, it's perfectly fine to use them. Otherwise, prefer to select elements by their ID or class. In this lesson, we're going to talk about another group of selectors called Pseudo-class Selectors. The name might sound a little bit complicated, but the underlying concept is actually very simple and useful. So let's define an article with 2 paragraphs. Now let's generate some dummy text here. Good. Now let's say we want to style the first paragraph and make the font bigger and italic. Here's one way to do this. We can give this paragraph a class, like first. Then we go to our style sheet and define a style for paragraphs with the class of first. Here we can set font size to 140%, so it's larger. And we can set font style to italic. Take a look. That's what we get. Very nice. Now, as I told you before, when we use class selectors, it's often a good practice to drop the element type. So if tomorrow we change the type of this element to something else, our rules will not break. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter as much because it's very unlikely that we're going to replace a paragraph with something else. But I'm going to drop it regardless. Now, this rule will apply to any element with the class of first. What if we want this rule to be applied only to our articles? Well, here we can type the article element to give this a context, okay? So here's a basic way of doing this. However, the first step here was unnecessary. We didn't have to assign this element a class because in CSS, we have a bunch of pseudo classes that are automatically applied by the browser. So pseudo classes are not real classes that we define. They're classes that browsers apply by default. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to remove the class attribute. Now back to our style sheet. Instead of using this real class, we're going to use a pseudo class. All pseudo classes start with a colon. And here we type first child. Now, look, we get the same result as before, and we didn't have to assign a class to the first paragraph. What we have over here is called a pseudo-class selector. So just like we have class selectors, we also have pseudo-class selectors. Now, this first child selector is very useful, but it's a little bit fragile. Let me show you what I mean. So back to our markup, let's add a heading here and see what happens. See what happened? The first paragraph is no longer styled. The style that we defined is now applied to the heading because the heading is the first child of this article. Let's verify this. So right-click on the heading, go to Inspect. Now, over here, look at the rule that we just defined. This rule is applied to the heading because it's the first child of the article element. So this is the problem with the first child selector. If we move elements around, our CSS rules may break. So here we can use another pseudo-class selector called first of type. Let's see how this works. So back to the browser. Look, both the heading and the first paragraph got the style that we just defined. What is going on here? Well, let's inspect this element one more time. So in this article, we have one heading element and 2 paragraphs. This pseudo-class selector, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different types. So here's the first H2 that we have. That is why this rule is applied to this element. Now, below the heading, we have 2 paragraphs, and the first paragraph received the style that we just defined. So this pseudo-class, first of type, is applied to the first occurrence of elements of different type in a container. Back to our style sheet, we want this rule to be applied only to the first paragraph in our article. So here we have to specify the element type, which is P. Now, back to the browser. Look, the first paragraph is italic, but the heading is not. So this is how first of type selector works. Now, similarly, we have 2 other selectors called last child and last of type. Let's look at an example. So if you want to style the last paragraph in this article, we can say article P colon last of type. And here we can set font weight to bold. Now, look, the last paragraph is bold. Now, in this particular case, because this paragraph is the last child of the article, here we can also use last child. We get the same result. However, as I told you before, first child and last child are a little bit fragile, So if you add or remove elements, our rules may break. For example, if you add an anchor here, see, the last paragraph is no longer bold. But what about the link? How come the link is not bold? Because here we're targeting a paragraph that is the last child of the article. Currently, the last child of our article is not a paragraph element. It's a hyperlink. If we want this rule to be effective, we can remove the element type. And now this rule is applied to the last child of the article, irrespective of its type. So save the changes. Look, the link is bold. Now, sometimes we want to style elements based on their position in a container. For example, let's say we have a table or a list, and we want to highlight all the odd items. So here I'm going to define an unordered list. Inside this list, we're going to have 5 list items. So li times 5. Now, in each list item, we want to have some text like item 1, item 2, and so on. So here in braces, we can type item followed by a $sign. The $sign will be replaced by the numbers 1 to 5. So press tab. Here's what we get. Beautiful. Now we want to style all the odd items in this list. So back to our style sheet. We grab an unordered list and then select list items that are odd. So here we're going to use another pseudo-class selector called nth child. Now this selector is like a function in programming languages. So in between parentheses, we can pass a value or an argument. So if you specify odd, this rule will target all the odd items in our list. So here we can set the color to deep pink. Take a look. Note that all the odd items are pink, and also the entire list is in bold, because now the list is the last child of the article element, okay? Now, similar to odd, we have even. Now, all the even items are styled. We can also use a formula here, like 3n. This will select every third item in our list. It's not something that used that often, but just be aware of it. We also have a few pseudo-class selectors for working with hyperlinks. For example, look at this link. This link is currently displayed in purple because it's visited. This is the default color that browsers apply to visited links. But I don't like this color. I think it's ugly. So to select visited hyperlinks, we can type a:visited and then apply a style here. We can set the color to something more interesting like Dodger blue. Okay, now look, this is much better. But what about a link that we haven't visited? So let's change the href here to https some weird website we haven't visited.com. Okay, look, this is the default blue assigned to hyperlinks. Once again, I don't like this color. So here we can add a comma and select all anchors that are links. This link pseudo-class is automatically applied to all hyperlinks. Now, take a look. That's much better. But what about the hover effect? Let's say when the user hovers their mouse over this link, the color should change to pink. So here we can say a:hover. This pseudo-class is applied when the user hovers over an element. It doesn't have to be a link. It can be anything, a div, a section, an image, pretty much anything. Now here we can set the color to deep pink. Now, look, that is much nicer. But let me show you something. We can use the tab key to go over some of the elements on this page. As you probably know, some users prefer to use keyboards. So if we press the tab key, our hyperlink is in focus, but the color hasn't changed. So as a best practice, whenever we use the hover pseudo-selector, we should also use the focus pseudo-selector. This pseudo-class is applied when the user goes over the elements on the page using the tab key. Now, save the changes. Take a look. We can use the tab key to select this link, and now our link has the right color. So this is all about pseudo-classes. Next, we're going to talk about pseudo-elements. Sometimes we want to style a part of an element, like the first letter or the first line of a paragraph. This is where we use pseudo-element selectors. Let me show you how they work. So let's define a paragraph with some dummy text. Now we want to style the first letter of this paragraph. So I've selected the letter L. Now let's bring up the command palette and wrap the selection with a span element. So we have a span. Next, we can give this span a class like first letter. And then we can go to our style sheet and define a rule for elements with this class. Here we can set the font size to 140%, and we can also make the font bold. Okay, so here's what we get. That's pretty nice. You have seen this style in a lot of books, right? Now, this first step here was completely unnecessary because in CSS, we have a bunch of pseudo elements for this very reason. So I'm going to delete this span. Now, back to the style sheet. Instead of this class, we're going to use a Pseudo-element Selector. So we type P to target paragraphs. Then we type double colons followed by first letter. So we use double colons for pseudo elements, but a single colon for pseudo classes. What is the difference? Well, we use pseudo elements to style a part of an element. In contrast, we use pseudo classes to style an element in a particular state, like an anchor that is hovered. So let's save the changes. Look, we get the same result as before, and we didn't have to add a span to our markup. We have another pseudo element for selecting the first line of a paragraph. So we type P, double colons, first line. Here we can set font weight to bold. Now look, the entire first line is bold. Now if we select some text, by default, the background of the selection becomes blue. We can change that using a pseudo element. So we type P, double colon, selection. Here we can set the background color to pink. Now, the background is pink. However, this style is only applied to selections in paragraphs. So if we go to our markup and add a heading, and then select this heading, the background is still blue. So to make this rule more flexible, we can remove the element type, and now any element that is selected will have a pink background. So let's save the changes. There you go. We have another useful pseudo element for inserting content before the content of an element. Let me show you what I mean. So back to our markup. Here we have a paragraph, and here's the content of the paragraph. What if we want to insert something before the content of every paragraph on our page? We go to our style sheet and type P, double colon, before. Here we set the content property to, let's say, ... Let's see what we get. So now we have ... before the content of our paragraph. Let's right-click on ... inspect it. So here's our paragraph. Let's expand it. Do you see the pseudo element? Colon, colon, before. So this pseudo element is like an element that is inserted into the DOM, but it's not a real concrete HTML element like a paragraph or a span. It's a pseudo element. Now, the content of this element is just ... but we can apply any other styles here. For example, we can set the display property to block, and this will convert this element from an inline element to a block level element. Remember the differences? A block level element starts on a new line and takes up the entire available space. So now, back to the browser, this pseudo element that we inserted is a block level element. It has taken the entire available space, and as a result of that, our paragraph starts on a new line. So with this pseudo element, we can insert some content before the content of an element. Similarly, we have another pseudo element called after for inserting content after the content of an element. So if we save the changes, now ... appears at the end of our paragraph. So if you have multiple paragraphs, every paragraph will have this new content at the end. So this is all about pseudo elements in CSS. Quite often, we end up in a situation where more than one rule can target a given element, and these rules can have conflicting styles. So let me show you how the browser figures out what rules should be applied. So let's define an article, and inside this article, let's define an h1 with the class of highlight. Okay, so here we say heading. Now, back to our style sheet, let's write a couple of different rules. We can write a rule for h1 elements and set their color to Dodger blue. Also, we can write a rule for elements with the class of highlight and set their color to deep pink. So now, both these rules target this h1 element. But which rule do you think is going to be applied? This is where selector specificity comes to play. Each selector has what we call a specificity or a weight. If multiple rules target the same element, the browser will apply the rule that is more specific. Now look at this triangle. This is what I call the specificity triangle. At the top of this triangle, we have the ID selector, because as you know, we cannot have two elements with the same ID. So the ID selector is very specific. It can only target a single element. Below the ID selector, we have class and attribute selectors. These selectors are less specific because we can have multiple elements with the same class or attributes. At the next level, we have the element selector because we can have many elements of a given type. So back to our style sheet, which selector do you think is more specific? The second selector, because we can have many H1 elements, but not all these H1 elements may have the class of highlight. So a class selector is more specific. And here in the browser, you can see our heading is pink. Now let me show you something. Let's right-click on the heading and go to Inspect. Here on the right side, you can see the class selector applied to this element that sets the color to pink. Below this selector, we have the element selector that sets the color to blue. But this property declaration is crossed out because it's been overwritten with the other property declaration over here. Now further down, we have another element selector that comes from Normalized.css. So this style sheet applies a couple of styles to H1 elements. Further down, we have another element selector that comes from User Agent style sheet. These are the default styles that Chrome applies to various elements. So every browser defines a set of styles for various HTML elements. That is why sometimes these styles are different, and we use Normalized.css to normalize these styles. So we start from a common ground. Now back to our style sheet. Let's look at a few more examples. Another way to target this element is using an ID selector. So here in our markup, let's give this element an ID of products. Now back to our style sheet. Here we can define a rule for an element with the ID of products. And then we can set the color to green. This selector is the most specific selector, so now our heading is green. Now, what if we have two selectors with equal specificity or equal weight? So let's duplicate this rule and change the color to, let's say, brown. Which rule do you think will be applied? The rule that comes last. So if I save the changes here and go back to browser, look, our heading is brown. All right, now let's get rid of this rule. We don't need it anymore. Let me show you something really cool in VS Code. If we hover our mouse over a selector, we can see its weight or specificity. So here in parentheses, we have three numbers. The first number on the left represents the number of ID selectors. In this case, we have 0 because we don't have an ID selector. The number in the middle represents the number of class or attribute selectors. Again, we have 0 because we don't have a class or attribute selector. And finally, the number on the right represents the number of element selectors. Here we have one element selector. That is why we have 1 here. So overall, the specificity of this element is 1. Now compare this with the specificity of this other selector. Here we have 0, 1, 0 because we have one class selector and the total specificity is 10. So 10 is greater than 1, and that is why this selector, or this rule more accurately, takes precedence. So our heading is currently green, but what if we want it to be blue? How can we prevent this rule from overwriting this style? Well, we have two solutions here. One solution is to use the important keyword. So as part of this declaration, we type an exclamation mark followed by the important keyword. When we apply this keyword, other rules will be discarded. Let me show you. So save the changes and back in the browser, our heading is blue. Now let's inspect it. So even though we have more specific rules, these rules are ignored because we have used the important keyword. Now, while this looks like an easy solution, you should avoid it as much as possible. Using the important keyword is considered a bad practice because it can make your CSS messy and hard to maintain. You will end up wasting a lot of time troubleshooting and fixing styling issues. So let's get rid of this and talk about a better solution. The reason our heading is green is because of the third rule we have applied here. Now, what is the specificity of this rule? It is 100. So to make the heading blue, we have to write a rule that is more specific. So look at these three numbers here. The left number represents the number of ID selectors, the middle number represents the class or attribute selectors, and the right number represents the element selectors. So the rule that we want to write should have at least one ID selector and additionally a class or an element selector. So here we can select an element with the class of highlight and the ID of products. So here we have one class selector and one ID selector. Let's look at the specificity. That is 110. So now, if we set the color to Dodger blue, our heading turns blue. Beautiful. Now, instead of a class selector, we can use an element selector. So we can target an H1 with the ID of products. This selector is more specific than the previous one. Let's look at the specificity. That is 101 compared to 100. So once again, we get a blue heading. Let me show you another way. Let's give this article element an ID or a class of featured. Now, back to our style sheet. We can select an element with the class of featured, and in this element, we can target an element with the ID of products. What do you think is the specificity of this rule? It should be 110 because we have one class selector and one ID selector. Take a look. 110. So we can get rid of the important keyword by writing a more specific selector. But don't go overboard with this approach. For example, I don't want you to write a selector like HTML, body, featured, H2, products, highlight. This selector is way too specific. It's really hard to read and understand this. And if in the future we run into styling issues, we'll have to write even a more specific selector. So our CSS will become really messy and hard to maintain. One of the important concepts in CSS you need to understand is the concept of inheritance, which means some CSS properties by default inherit values from their parent. Let's go through a few examples. So I'm going to define a paragraph with some dummy text. Now let's wrap this word inside a strong element. So we bring up the command palette, search for wrap, and then type strong. So here's what we get. Now, here in our style sheet, let's define a rule for paragraph elements and set their color to Dodger blue. Take a look. So our strong element is blue, even though we didn't explicitly set its color. This is inheritance in action. So the strong element is currently a child of the paragraph element, and it has inherited the color property. Let's verify it. So we right-click on this element and go to inspect. Now look over here. These are the properties inherited from the paragraph element, in this case, color. So with inheritance, we didn't have to come here and set the color property on the strong element. So inheritance helps us write less code. But what if in this particular case, we want to stop the inheritance? What if we don't want to inherit this value? Well, we set the value to initial. This sets the color property to its default value, which is black. So here's what we get. Now let's look at the property that does not get inherited. So here in the paragraph, let's set the border to 1 pixel, solid, black. Take a look. So we have a border around our paragraph, but there's no border around the strong element because it doesn't make sense to define a border on a parent element and then every child inherits that border. It doesn't make sense. But what if we want to force the inheritance here? Well, here in the rule for the strong element, we set border to inherit. Now we're explicitly saying that we want to inherit the border property. So here's the result. We have an extra border around the strong element. So this is inheritance in action. But what properties are inherited? Well, there's a long list, and quite frankly, you don't have to memorize it. Most people don't know it. Most of the time, as you build more web pages or as you go through the course, you will get familiar with these properties. But generally speaking, the properties that are about typography are the ones that are inherited. So properties that change the font size, the vertical space between lines, the alignment of text, the color of the text, these are the properties that get inherited. All right, now let's talk about colors. In CSS, we have a few different ways to represent colors. We can use named colors, RGB values, HSL values, and hexadecimal values. Let's see this in action. So I'm going to define a div with the class of box. Now, let's define a row and give our box a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and a background color. Now, open up Google and search for color picker. So here in Google, we have a built-in color picker, but pretty much every design tool also has a color picker. So over here, we can move this pointer around to select a different color. Now, over here, look, as we move the pointer around, these values get updated, right? So what are these values? Well, let's look at RGB first. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So RGB is short for red, green, blue, and these three values represent the degree of red, green, and blue. So each value can be a number between 0 to 255. Now, you don't have to memorize any of this stuff. All I want you to understand is that this color that you can see over here can be represented by a combination of red, green, and blue according to these values. So if we copy these values, and then over here, we can use the RGB function to set the background color. So we paste the values, save the changes, and here's what we get. Now we have another function called RGBA, which is short for alpha. So with this function, we can supply an extra value, and this value can be a decimal number between 0 and 1. 0 means completely transparent, and 1 means completely opaque. So if we use a value like 0.5 here, our box is semi-transparent. So if you have something underneath, like an image, that image will be visible. This is a very popular technique we use in CSS. So RGB is one way to represent this number, but we can also represent it using the hexadecimal system. Hexadecimal is one of the many numerical systems. We have the binary system that contains the digits 0 and 1. We have the decimal system that contains the digits 0 to 9, and this is the system that we use to represent numbers. Hexadecimal is another system that contains the digits 0 to 9, as well as the letters A to F. We can represent any number in the world using any of these systems. Now, the actual mathematical concepts behind this is irrelevant here. You don't need to learn them. But let's look at a practical example. Look at this hexadecimal value. Here we have 6 characters, and every 2 characters represent one of the numbers in the RGB system. So E6 is the hexadecimal representation of 230 in the decimal system. As another example, CD is the hexadecimal representation of 205 in the decimal system. That is the concept behind this. So instead of using an RGB value, we can use a hexadecimal value. So we copy this and paste it over here. Here's what we get. Now, the limitation of hexadecimal system is that here we don't have the transparency channel. So if you want to make this box semi-transparent, we have to use the RGBA system. Another system for representing colors on the web is the HSL system, which is short for hue, saturation, lightness. Once again, we have 3 values here. The first value is the degree of the color on a standard color wheel. So look over here. Here we have a standard color wheel. That degree determines the tone of the color. Is it blue, red, green, or what? The second value is the percentage of the saturation, which can be a number between 0 to 100. So as we increase this value, our color becomes more saturated. Let me show you what I mean. So over here, if I move this pointer to the left, our color is less saturated, right? And now look, the saturation is reduced to 65%. The third value is the lightness. So as we increase this value, the color becomes brighter. And as we decrease it, it becomes darker and gets closer to black. Some people prefer the HSL system because they can pick the color shade and then play with these 2 numbers to create different shades of that color. So as an example, let's copy these values. And then over here, we're going to use the HSL function and paste these values. Just remember to remove the degree character because this is not a valid character in CSS. So save the changes. Here's what we get. Now, if we increase the saturation and let's say make it 100, our color is more saturated. We can also reduce the brightness and make it, let's say, 40%. And here's what we get. So this is the HSL system. Now, similar to RGB, we have a variation of this system that is HSL-A, which is short for alpha channel. So we can supply a force value here, which can be a decimal value between 0 to 1. If you want a semi-transparent box, we can use a value like 0.5. Now here in Chrome, we also have a color picker. Let me show you. So let's inspect this element. Here's the background color. Currently, we're using the HSL system. We can click on this box and see this color picker here. So I prefer this shade, that's better. Now over here, we can see the individual values, 53 for hue, 93% for saturation, 51% for lightness, and 1 for alpha, which means completely opaque. Now, if we change these values here, our CSS is not updated. So here we have to press Enter to accept the values. Now we can copy this and paste it in our CSS. Now look, here's another way to represent HSL values. So instead of separating these values using commas, we have 53 degrees, 93%, and 51%. So this is all about color systems. Now, which system is the best? There is no such a thing. Depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. But in my experience, most people prefer the hexadecimal system because it's shorter and more compact. But of course, RGB and HSL have their own uses. Now that you have learned about colors, let's talk about gradients. With gradients, we can create beautiful transitions between two or more colors. So continuing with the example from the last lesson, here we have set the background color property. Now we want to use a gradient. Now, gradients are technically images. So to set a gradient here, we cannot use the background color property. We should either use the background image property or the shorthand background property. We can set the background property to either a color or an image. So I'm going to replace this color with a gradient. To create a gradient, we call the linear gradient function and pass two colors. We can say Dodger blue and yellow. Now here I'm using named colors, but we can also use hexadecimal colors, RGB colors, RGBA colors, and so on. So let's save the changes and see what we get. Look, we get this beautiful transition from blue to yellow. Now by default, the direction of this transition is from top to bottom, but we can easily change it. So back to our function, as the first value or the first argument, we supply the direction. We can say to right. Now our gradient starts from the left and goes to the right. We can also target corners like bottom right. So we can say to bottom right. Now the transition starts from the top left and goes to the bottom right. We can also specify a degree for more control over the transition. So look at these numbers, 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and so on. So if we say 45 degrees, our transition will start from bottom left and goes to top right. Take a look. So we can say 45 degrees, and here's what we get. Now we can also specify the position of these colors. For example, we can say the yellow should start at about 30% of the available space. So take a look. Now, most of the box is filled with yellow. If we change it to, let's say, 90%, the yellow is pushed over here. Now we can also supply more than two colors. For example, over here, let's get rid of this position and supply a third color like tomato. Here's what we get. So we can get pretty creative with these colors. So this is all about linear gradients. But in CSS, we have another type of gradient called radial gradient. So let's remove this value. And here we're going to call the radial gradient function. Just like before, we give it two colors. We can say white and yellow. So in the middle, we have a white circle that gradually transitions to yellow on the corners. Now here we have a circle shape because our div, our container, is a square. But if we change the width of this box and set it to 600, look, now instead of a circle, we have an ellipse. But we can easily create a circle. So as the first argument of this function, we pass circle. Now we get a circle in the middle, but we can also change the position of the circle. So we can say circle at top left. Take a look. Our circle starts here and gradually transitions to yellow. So this is how we can create gradients. But we also have online tools that help us easily create gradients, and they generate the CSS code for us. Let me show you. So here in Google, search for gradient generator. There are many tools out there. The one that I personally like is cssgradient.io. Look, here we have a gradient with 3 colors. All these colors are listed over here. We can see their hexadecimal value and their position. So the first color starts at 0%, the second color starts at 33%, and so on. Now in this demo, I just want to have 2 colors. So let's get rid of the second color. We have a purple and a yellow. Now we can easily change these colors. So here's the yellow we selected, and then over here, we can change it to a different color like orange. Similarly, we can select this purple and move this slider around to get a different color. Now by dragging these sliders, we can change the position of these colors. So now look, the orange starts at 8%, and that's why most of the box is filled with orange. I'm going to move it to, let's say 90%. That looks good to me. Now down below, we can change the angle of this gradient. So by default, it's set to 90%, but we can change it to, let's say 32%. And here's what we get. Now, over here, we can find the CSS code for this gradient. So look, we have 2 properties. Background, which is set to just a plain color, that is an RGB color. And after that, we have a second background property that is set to linear gradient. Why do we have 2 properties? Because even though most browsers these days support gradients, there are still some old browsers that don't support gradients. So we use a plain color as a fallback for those browsers. If those browsers don't understand this linear gradient, they're going to ignore the second background property. So they will only see a plain color, which is this RGB color. Now we can copy this to clipboard and paste it over here. Now take a look. So here's the end result. Much easier than creating a gradient by hand. All right, now let's talk about borders. We briefly talked about the border property before, but let's revisit it one more time with more detail. So this property takes 3 values. The first value is the thickness of the border. We can use 1 pixel for a really thin border, or 10 pixels for a thicker border. The second value is the style of the border. We can use solid, but we have other styles that we're going to look at in this lesson. The third value is the color. I'm going to go with royal blue. Once again, we can use a hexadecimal color or an RGB color and so on. So let's see what we get. Now, let's change solid to dotted. So instead of a solid line, we get a bunch of dots. Another popular style is dashed. Here's what we get. We have a bunch of other styles, but quite frankly, nobody uses them anymore. We used those styles 20 years ago, so I'm not going to go over them. Now, one thing you need to understand here is that this border property is what we call a shorthand property. It takes these values and applies them to borders on each side. But in CSS, we have a few other properties for defining the border on each side. For example, we can say border top should be 20 pixels, solid, royal blue. Let's see what we get. So the top border is thicker. Similarly, we have border right, border bottom, and border left. Now, one thing you need to pay attention to here is that the order of these lines matters. So here we have defined the general border on each side, that is 10 pixels thick, but then we are saying the top border should be 20 pixels thick. If I move this line up, see what we get? All borders are the same. So the order of these lines matters. In addition to border top, border right, border bottom, and border left, we also have border width. With this, we can specify the width of all borders. So remember this shape: top, right, bottom, left. This is how I memorize this syntax. So the first value represents the width of the top border. Let's say 10 pixels. The second value represents the width of the right border, 20 pixels. Then we have bottom and then left. Let's see what we get. So top, right, bottom, and left. Now, another way to memorize this is TRBL. Top, right, bottom, left. You can say turbo. Now what we have on the right side is called a comment. We use comments to explain why we have done something in our code. They're completely ignored by browsers, okay? So this is how we can remember this syntax. Now, what if we remove one of these values? That was the width of the left border. In this case, the browser uses the same value as the right border. So take a look. We get the same result as before. Now, what if we remove this other value? That was the width of the bottom border. In this case, the browser takes the width of the top border. So once again, we get the same result as before. So in summary, 1020 is the same as 1020, 1020. This is the short way of writing this code. Now, what if we remove this value? We only have 10 pixels. The browser will apply this width to all borders, okay? Now, similarly, we have border style. Once again, we can supply different styles for top, right, bottom, and left borders. And we also have border color. Now, we have other longhand properties like border top color, border left color, and so on. But quite frankly, they're hardly used. 99% of the time, we use the shorthand form. So you don't need to memorize any of these properties. Just be aware that you have full control over the width, style, and color of each of the borders, okay? Now, one other property we're going to talk about in this lesson is border radius. We briefly talked about this before. With border radius, we can make the corners round. So if we supply a value like 10 pixels, we get a little bit of round corners. If we increase this value and say 50 pixels, we get even more rounded corners. Now, earlier I showed you a trick. If you have a square, so let's change the width to 200 pixels. If you have a square and set the border radius to 100%, we get a full circle. Now, using CSS, we can also create other shapes like triangles, stars, and so on. I'm not going to go over them in this course because they become repetitive. You can learn them on your own. Let me just show you what to look for. So in Google, search for CSS shapes and look at this article on csstricks.com, the shapes of CSS. This is a great website for learning CSS. So this is how we can create a square. We can also create a rectangle, circle, which you have seen. Now, in this example, we have border radius set to 50%. That should work most of the time, but in my experience, sometimes we don't get a perfect circle. So I personally prefer to use 100% for the border radius. Then we have oval, triangle up, triangle down, and so on. So in case you're curious, look at this page to see what other shapes you can create with CSS. All right, now let's talk about shadows. In CSS, we can easily add shadows around elements using the box shadow property. Here we have to supply a few values. The first value is the horizontal distance of the shadow to the element. If you use a positive value here, this will move the shadow to right. And if you use a negative value, this will move the shadow to left. You will see that in a second. So let's go with 10 pixels. The second value is the vertical distance of the shadow to the element. Once again, if you use a positive value, this will move the shadow down. And if you use a negative value, this will move the shadow up. So before going any further, let's save the changes and see what we get. So here it is. Look, we have moved the shadow 10 pixels right and 10 pixels down. Now, if we supply a negative value here, this will move the shadow 10 pixels left. Take a look. So our shadow moved 10 pixels to the left of the box. So let's go with 10 pixels and 10 pixels. Now, if you want to change the color, we can pass that here. We can say gray. And once again, we can use a hexadecimal color, an RGB color, and so on. So now we get a gray shadow. Now, what if you want to make this shadow a little bit softer? Here we can supply a third value to determine how much we want to soften or blur the shadow. Let's go with 10 pixels. Look, our shadow is softer. Let's go with a higher value. Let's say 30 pixels. It's even softer. There's just one tiny problem. Because we moved the shadow 10 pixels right and 10 pixels down, it's not covering the top and left side of the box. So let me show you a cool trick here. If you want to have a very soft shadow, it is best to put the shadow right below the element. So we're not going to supply a horizontal and a vertical distance. We're going to pass 0 and 0. This will place the shadow right under the box, and with this blur, we'll see a very nice effect around the box. Take a look. Here it is. So this is how we can add shadows to elements. But we can also add shadows to our text. So here in index.html, let's add a heading inside this box. Heading. We get a black heading. First, I want to change the color of the heading to white because typically white text looks better on blue background. So let's go to our style sheet and define a rule for h1 element. Here we're going to set the color to white. Now, using the text shadow property, we can add a shadow to this heading. The values that we should pass here are exactly the same values that we have for the box shadow property. So we can move the shadow 3 pixels right, 3 pixels down, and make it 5 pixels soft, and set the color to, let's say, gray. Now take a look. Here's what we get. Let me zoom in. I want to show you a problem with this shadow. This gray shadow is not mixing properly with the blue background. It's kind of off. Do you see that? Let me show you a cool trick. So instead of passing an explicit color like gray, we're going to use a semi-transparent black. So we use the RGBA function. Now we pass 0, 0, and 0 to represent the pure black. Now using the fourth value, we can specify the transparency. 0 means completely transparent, and 1 means completely opaque. For this demo, I'm going to go with, let's say, 0.2. So this is a semi-transparent black. Now take a look. See, the shadow is beautifully blending with the blue background. And that means if we change the color of the background, the shadow will continue to blend properly. So let's set the background to gold. Take a look. Our shadow is still blending with the background. We can go with a different color like coral. Look, it's always working. So this is one of those cases where you may want to use an RGBA color. That's why earlier I told you that there's no right or wrong when it comes to representing colors. Sometimes a hexadecimal value makes sense, other times an RGBA color. All right, we have reached the end of the first part of this series. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your instructor, and I hope you have learned a lot. In the next part, we're going to talk about the advanced concepts in HTML and CSS. We'll talk about layouts, topography, images, forms, transformations, transitions, animations, and writing clean and maintainable CSS code. If you want to build real websites, you have to master this concept, and that's what the second part is all about. So, I will see you in the next part.